You should all have a copy of the program, which has descriptions of each speaker. Therefore, I will not read biographies of anybody. I will not present anybody. I will just call them to speak. All I will say is that all of these individuals have been working in Cuba extensively for many years. They have published articles, books on the like, and they are really seasoned observers of the Cuban process. Juan Triana has been at the Centro de Estudio de la Economía Cubana for many years, continues to be, and is doing a great job. And he's going to talk about an update on the ajuste externo. He will address us in Spanish. Español, ¿no?
Yes, I prefer to speak in Spanish because my English is really not good.
Está perfecto, mejor que el mío.
No, really. It's good for me to speak in Spanish. Okay, maybe in Spanglish. Sometime in Spanish, sometime in English. It's better, I think.
We have PowerPoint presentations.
Okay.
We have PowerPoint presentations in English. So those of you who may have difficulties following the main thing. These are going to be very short presentations because we don't have time for more. And we want to cover a lot of territory. Again, we want feedback, critical feedback, constructive feedback of the presentations. The idea is to publish something that is decent, that reflects the depth and the seriousness of the process in Cuba. And that's what we are all endeavor to accomplish in this council gathering. So Juan, you want to start?
Okay.
You can use your podium or you can stay there.
I prefer to be sit.
It's up to you.
Okay. And but the computer is over there. Yeah. Okay. Don't worry.
Tenía que cambiarlo aquí.
Gracias.
Thank you.
It's a very important instrument.
I would ask the presenters to take probably about 15, 16 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and answers and comments.
50 minutes?
15.
Okay, 15.
Most point is 15.
No, 50, 15.
15.
Gracias. Bueno, muchísimas gracias por la invitación. Gracias a la invitación, pero gracias fundamentalmente a las personas que la componen, o sea, Mauricio, que fue quien nos invitó, y a Rosalina, que no está aquí ahora creo, pero que ha cargado con todo lo que es los trámites de escribirnos, explicarnos cosas, que realmente son a veces engorrosos. Así que muchas gracias. Yo escribí un paper, un artículo para esta presentación. Y lo que voy a hacer es un poquitico decir qué es lo que hay dentro del artículo, no más que eso. Lo otro es que quisiera que todos entendieran que no voy a descubrir nada nuevo. O sea, en realidad voy a intentar hacer una especie de pequeña historia de cómo ha sido este proceso de transformación que ahora Cuba está viviendo y que se está enmarcando en lo que los cubanos llamamos lineamientos económicos y sociales, que tiene por objetivo, así ha sido dicho y es popularmente conocido, la actualización del modelo. En mi opinión personal, hay mucho más que una mera actualización de algo. Yo creo que Cuba está construyendo cosas nuevas, a veces con muchísima dificultad y con tremendas incertidumbres, porque mucho de lo que se está haciendo para el caso de Cuba, cuando se aplica a Cuba, a veces los propios instrumentos que son los más comunes, pues no resultan totalmente viables a la hora de aplicar. Así se titula. Lo primero que yo escribí fue un pequeño epígrafe. Yo soy historiador de pensamiento económico, lo he sido durante mis últimos 38 años, lo que he hecho como profesor de la Universidad de La Habana. Y por lo tanto siempre me gusta ver la historia. Y lo primero es que la historia realmente importa y entender qué es lo que está pasando en Cuba hoy nos obliga un poquitico a entender cuál ha sido la historia y dónde están los precedentes de lo que está pasando. Lo segundo es un epígrafe que se titula El camino hacia lo desconocido. Sí, ya. Sí. El camino hacia lo desconocido. Y realmente de lo que se trata es de explicar un poco esos primeros años de transformaciones a partir de que Raúl toma la presidencia del gobierno y lo que fue en realidad ese proceso. Y lo tercero es, a mi juicio, que desde el 2011 hasta la fecha, o sea, desde abril de 2011 hasta la fecha, se ha avanzado sobre todo en ir diseñando, quizá dando los trazos más generales de lo que pudiera decirse es el país que se pretende tener no en el 2015 o el 2016, sino mucho más allá, porque esos lineamientos que se van a aplicar y se están aplicando desde ahora hasta el 2015 es más que es cuando más una fase de preparación para poder lograr condiciones que le permitan al país avanzar más en el camino al desarrollo. Entonces, sobre lo primero, yo lo único que quiero señalar acá es que Cuba ha vivido en los últimos años, en los años más recientes de su historia contemporánea, tres grandes procesos de transformación. Los tres muy interesantes, los tres muy traumáticos. El primero, en 1959, sumamente profunda, abarcó toda la sociedad, incluso significó un cambio hasta de la filosofía y la manera de comportarse de las personas, pasando lógicamente por temas éticos, morales, instituciones, y que fue realmente traumático porque Cuba perdió su principal socio, el país del cual dependía de una manera casi umbilical, ¿no? Tuvo que cambiar desde la tecnología hasta la manera en que el país funcionaba, desde una economía capitalista subdesarrollada hacia una economía subdesarrollada y socialista, copiando en mucho, no en todo, porque en definitiva somos caribeños y cubanos y siempre somos innovadores en eso de la copia, pero copiando en mucho la manera de hacer economía, que era la manera que tipificaba a las economías socialistas, especialmente a la economía soviética. El segundo, en 1989, cuando se repitió el mismo problema. Y nos volvimos a quedar sin el socio más importante, sin el país del cual dependíamos, y eso llevó lógicamente a un choque externo fundamental. En ambos casos, en el 59 y en el 89, el choque externo ha jugado un papel significativo en el ajuste cubano, muy significativo. No se puede decir que la revolución sea el producto de un choque externo, pero sí la transformación que posee a la revolución fue en mucho resultado de un profundo choque externo que hizo que Cuba perdiera las 3/4 partes de su mercado azucarero, la totalidad de su mercado azucarero y prácticamente las 3/4 partes de su ingreso por exportación. En el 89 ocurrió lo mismo y fue más profundo, porque paradójicamente Cuba era más dependiente del azúcar y de la Unión Soviética en 1989 de lo que lo era de Estados Unidos en 1959. O sea, nuestra dependencia del mercado norteamericano en 1959 en cuanto al tema azucarero era de alrededor de un 65-70%, y nuestra dependencia del mercado soviético en 1989 era prácticamente del 80%. Por lo tanto, volvimos a sufrir el choque externo. Tampoco yo creo que la crisis que Cuba vive en el 89 sea única y exclusivamente producto del choque externo. Hay muchas investigaciones que así lo han probado. Había infinidad de señales, desde 1986 sobre todo, que estaban indicando que Cuba entraba en un proceso de recesión importante, que se hizo todavía más profundo, mayor y más complejo de resolver exactamente por el choque externo que ocurrió en 1989. Pero las señales de ese proceso de recesión, ya eran evidentes. Y el 2011, a mi juicio, es otro momento. 4 años después de que Raúl tome el poder, lo toma en condiciones muy difíciles, por primera vez desde 20 años, el país se plantea no solo sobrevivir, sino desarrollarse y tratar de armar un proyecto de desarrollo. Eso no había pasado en 1990, con diferencia sustancial. Yo les traigo acá, para un poquitico ilustrar que la historia importa, el shock, el grave problema que Cuba tiene en el 2008, con un déficit comercial realmente impresionante, que generó una crisis de pago que duró prácticamente 2 años y medio, donde muchos acreedores, donde muchos proveedores se quedaron prácticamente 1 año, 18 meses, y algunos más de 18 meses sin cobrar los adeudos. Eso además provocó decisiones en el gobierno trascendentales como un recorte drástico de las importaciones. Cuba tiene una relación muy estrecha entre su capacidad de crecer y las importaciones, y por lo tanto todo lo que significa una reducción de las importaciones no hay cómo cubrirlo después con oferta interna. Eso hace que la reducción de las importaciones generalmente impacte, a veces de una mayor manera, o sea, la sensibilidad del crecimiento a las importaciones puede que no sea la misma en diferentes años, pero realmente siempre es una sensibilidad alta. Y además de eso, distorsiones que ya veníamos arrastrando, algunas de ellas de antes de 1989. Todo el mundo habla de que el problema de la tasa de cambio, la sobrevaluación de la tasa de cambio cubana, es un problema que surge en 1989-90, cuando Cuba introduce el dólar en la circulación, pero históricamente hay otra realidad, y es que la tasa de cambio en Cuba estaba sobrevaluada desde 1958, 1957, si mal no recuerdo, que ya Cuba en ese momento registra un déficit en su balanza comercial con Estados Unidos, y por lo tanto lo que habría que hacer en aquel momento era devaluar la tasa. El triunfo de la revolución evitó eso, y después el mantenimiento de una tasa de cambio fija y sobrevaluada se convirtió en un recurso de control y manejo de la política económica, muy afín con una economía centralizada. Eso era, yo diría, bastante consecuente. Esa es una de esas distorsiones, pero no es la única. Hay otras muchas distorsiones que se generaron después en 1959, en 1989, y que en los momentos en que Raúl comienza su presidencia realmente profundizaban la crisis y que hacían más complejo y hacen más complejo la salida de la crisis. Esto también tiene que ver con eso, solo para que entendamos la situación. Ahí lo que tenemos es la formación bruta de capital en un promedio que va desde 1990, ¿no? Desde el 2000. En el 2002, eso lo podemos entender, esta que está aquí a la derecha de ustedes. Si lo extendiéramos hacia atrás, de 1990, veríamos que el promedio de formación bruta de capital fijo en Cuba no cambia en los últimos 23 años y se mantiene por debajo del 11%. Es uno de los más bajos, si no el más bajo, de América Latina. Y del otro lado, lo que hay es la estructura de las inversiones, porque realmente con una capacidad muy baja de formación bruta de capital, ya eso es un problema. Si a eso sumamos una distorsión, o una distorsión no, un destino de las inversiones que no ayuda al crecimiento, pues entonces los problemas se hacen más complejos. Ahí está en 2 periodos. El periodo que va del 94 al 2010, que es cuando la economía cubana comienza a crecer, y ustedes verán cómo allí la barra que indica los bienes, que es la de abajo, y la que indica, no sé, ahora de aquí no lo veo bien, que aquí es otro juego. A ver, la de abajo, que es la que indica servicios comerciales, ya es azulita, y la de bienes, que es la medio morada, malva, que es la de arriba, estaban bastante iguales, 27% en el caso de bienes, o sea, inversiones para la producción de bienes, y 29% en inversiones en servicios no comerciales. Yo he dividido esto de una manera no tradicional, he puesto bienes, servicios comerciales y no comerciales, e infraestructura. Generalmente se pone bienes, servicios y infraestructura, pero a mí me gusta más así porque me indica mucho mejor dónde andaban los problemas, ¿no? Y las distorsiones. Si la comparan con la de arriba, verán que en el periodo 2000-2010 hubo realmente un cambio, un sesgo total hacia los servicios no comerciales, mientras que los bienes, realmente la inversión en bienes sufrió muchísimo. Y ese es un problema grave a la hora de enfrentar el crecimiento. Realmente esa manera en que se manejaron las inversiones en el país es una de las razones que provocó que en el año 2007-2008 el país estuviera muy desprovisto de capacidades para enfrentar la crisis de pago y para aprovechar mejor las inversiones externas que se estaban haciendo. Solo un dato que no lo he puesto aquí, pero que se los puedo decir: si ustedes comparan con 1989, el índice de producción física de la industria cubana en más de 16 ramas está el 30% de 1989. Claro que en 1989 no es comparación, mí no me gusta comparar con ese año porque el país en 1989 era otro país definitivamente, con otra estructura de costo, otra estructura de inversiones, otras fuentes de inversión, y por lo tanto a veces la comparación no es buena. Pero de todas maneras nos sirve para conocer por dónde andaba la industria y para ilustrarnos de la dificultad tremenda que un nuevo gobierno que asume el poder en 2007 tiene que enfrentar para poder sacar al país de la crisis. El camino hacia lo desconocido, muy rapidito, para que no me saquen el papelito ese. Que siempre nos sacan.
Papeleta,
Papeleta, ¿no? Todavía. Bueno, muy rápido. Aquí, en este epígrafe, lo único que hice fue ilustrar un poquitico los problemas iniciales con los que se enfrenta el gobierno y que intenta solucionar, fundamentalmente tomando un grupo de medidas, yo diría, puntuales. En realidad, desde el 2007 se comienza a tomar un grupito de medidas, no tan grupito, era un grupo de medidas grande, puntuales, determinadas cosas, para ir aliviando la situación del país, pero no hay de 2007 a 2011 una visión, yo diría, más abarcadora de los problemas del país. Se toman algunas medidas, se levantan algunas prohibiciones, algunas de ellas fueron realmente medidas muy publicitadas, como que los cubanos podían entrar en los hoteles, después que los cubanos podían comprar celulares. Al final eso no tenía un gran impacto en el crecimiento económico, ni en transformar la estructura productiva del país, ni en resolver las distorsiones del país, pero sí tenía un efecto importante desde el punto de vista de la población. O sea, eso de una u otra manera iba aliviando presiones, y yo creo que realmente jugó un papel, por lo menos no solo hacia la población, sino también hacia la gente, hacia el mismo aparato burocrático del Estado, de demostrar que los cubanos podían entrar en los hoteles y los hoteles no se caían. Ya eso era algo significativo. Eso toda la vida había sido un grave problema, no había quizás ninguna investigación seria que pudiera demostrar por qué que el cubano entrara a un hotel era malo para el crecimiento económico, para el desarrollo, pero lo cierto es que no entraba. Y lo cierto es que había también una especie de, yo diría, de pensamiento de que un hotel no resistía nunca una invasión de cubanos. Pues la resistió. Hoy los cubanos son uno de los grandes mercados en la época de baja, o sea, en los meses de julio y agosto del turismo. El sector de los cubanos que viven en Cuba se ha convertido en un mercado importante para esos hoteles y para el sector turístico. Y realmente, o sea, yo pienso que ese fue un momento importante, pero donde, digamos, es como si le estuviéramos poniendo parche a una camisa con muchos huecos, y se le ponía un parche aquí, otro hueco salía, se le ponía otro parche, pero no había una visión de conjunto del asunto, no había esa intención todavía. Lo que ocurre a partir de los lineamientos, que yo creo que es un proceso interesante, venimos de un evento donde en varias ocasiones se repitió que no había un plan, que no había una visión completa. Yo respeto todos los criterios, pero yo creo que a partir de 2011 hay una visión mucho más completa de la necesidad de transformar el país, y yo creo que se avanza muchísimo. Primero se avanza muchísimo porque se saca un documento que es programático, o sea, un programa de desarrollo, no de desarrollo, un programa de transformaciones, y se discute con toda la población. Podremos tener criterios a favor o en contra de ese proceso, pero lo cierto es que del documento que se saca a discutir al documento que se aprueba hay una diferencia sustancial. Cuando uno lo examina, no solo en la cantidad de elementos que se plantean en uno y en otro, o de lineamientos, sino también en la profundidad, en el avance, en un grado mayor de conservadurismo o no que aparece en ambos documentos. Eso es lo primero que yo creo que es importante. Lo segundo es que ese documento define qué es lo que hay que transformar. Quizás no está el 100% de lo que hay que transformar ahí, pero digamos que quizás sí está el 80% de casi todo lo que se debe transformar. Lo segundo es que se ratifique el socialismo como propósito. O sea, esto se está haciendo para modernizar el socialismo cubano, para hacer que se mantenga y sea mejor. Yo creo que eso es importante, aunque parezca evidente, pero creo que es importante definir ex ante cuál es el propósito de esa transformación. El presidente Raúl Castro lo ha dicho varias veces, que él no está en la presidencia para desmantelar el socialismo, sino todo lo contrario, para hacerlo más eficiente y mejor. Y esa es una señal importante también, más allá de que compartamos o no estas cosas. Ya casi estoy terminando. Lo otro es que se define la planificación como instrumento esencial y, además de eso, el mercado como algo necesario, de manera explícita, como nunca antes. Desde el liderazgo político se dice y se afirma y se sostiene que el mercado es significativo a la hora de manejar la economía. Ya después los matices y cómo se haga es otra discusión, pero está dicho y es importante que se diga desde el liderazgo político, muy importante. Lo otro es que lo que es diferente, si lo comparamos con las otras transformaciones, especialmente con la transformación que comienza en 1990, es primero que hay una asimilación política e ideológica de la necesidad de cambio, incluso de los actores del cambio y de la diversidad de los actores. Lo segundo, que se intenta una conceptualización teórica del modelo de funcionamiento de la economía, algo que no pasó en 1990. Y lo tercero es que se establece esta vez, a diferencia de 1990, que el desarrollo es una garantía para la continuidad y la mejora del socialismo cubano. En el año 90 la idea era exactamente al revés. El socialismo era la garantía de que Cuba se desarrollara. Y de hecho, antes de 1990, nuestra estrategia de desarrollo mecánicamente concebía que avanzando hacia el socialismo, el país iba a desarrollar. En 1989 nos dimos cuenta que no era así. Entonces yo creo que esos tres elementos son importantes. Me queda, después de esto, un slide. Quiero significar algunas cosas que son consensos hoy ya establecidos en lo que se está haciendo. Primero, que el crecimiento es una condición del desarrollo. Segundo, que una tasa alta de inversión es un factor decisivo para crecer. Eso tiene implicaciones desde el punto de vista político, que no las podemos decir, las podemos discutir después. Tercero, que la inversión extranjera es un elemento relevante para el desarrollo. No es complementario, no es relevante para el desarrollo. Cuarto, que la modernización institucional es un requisito que debe acompañar al desarrollo. Y aquí hay más que modernización, hay creación de instituciones. Realmente una economía que tiene que va a comenzar a expandir otras formas de propiedad y el mercado, definitivamente, todos lo conocemos, hay muchísimos estudios, Banco Mundial, Fondo Monetario y otros autores, la importancia de las instituciones para el desarrollo y para el mercado. Y por último, yo creo que es algo muy interesante, en los últimos 3-4 discursos del presidente del país se ha ido avanzando o ha lanzado algunas ideas que si nosotros las capturamos y las ponemos junticas, pues entonces nos dicen que de una u otra manera, desde el liderazgo, reitero, desde el liderazgo, aún eso no se ha llevado a la discusión pública, se ha ido intentando cumplir una visión del país que se resume en dos frases: una sociedad socialista, sustentable y próspera. Eso lo dice Raúl en diciembre de 2012, y después dice en febrero de 2013, una sociedad menos igualitaria pero más justa. Lógicamente está muy bien como visión, lo que de una u otra manera hemos trabajado en los temas de construcción de visión desde las empresas. Sabemos que tienen que ser corticas, que miren al futuro y tener los pies en la tierra. Eso hay que decodificar. Hay que decodificar qué cosa es próspera para Cuba. Hay que decodificar hasta dónde el crecimiento no atenta contra la sustentabilidad. O sea, hay un grupo de cosas que hay que decodificar qué cosa es una sociedad más justa para Cuba, que ha alcanzado niveles de justicia social elevados. O sea, hay un grupo de cosas que hay que hacer. Definitivamente es trabajo y va a dar para muchos más proyectos de investigación, lógicamente. Quizás eso hace que Mauricio nos vuelva a invitar aquí el año que viene, ¿no? Y eso va a ser bueno, digamos. Pero realmente yo creo que son temas hoy por hoy interesantes y apasionantes, aunque no estén totalmente resueltos. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Juan. Emily Morris is going to tell us about actually trends and prospects of the kind of variables that Juan was referring to: growth, crecimiento como condición, development, and the importance of a base, a material base for future developments.
Yo me puedo sentar ahí al frente para no tener problemas con el
Sí,
cuello.
de luego,
Gracias.
¿qué quieres?
It's Great pleasure to be here.
You have to speak close to the microphone
Close.
because this room is very strange.
Okay.
The acoustics.
Just do, if at both ends particularly, indicate vigorously if you can't hear, and I'll try to stoop a bit more. Okay. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to be here. And this is actually the third year in a row that I've been here. Yeah, I was here in 2011.
Thank you.
And actually there are some familiar faces here, and so those people will want to see, I think what I'm talking about is what's happened since last time, and picking up on the things that I've talked about before. And in the first talk, I was talking about forecasting the Cuban economy short-term, medium-term and long-term. And the second one, I was focusing on the risks. And actually it comes in quite nicely now to the third one, to see where we've got to now with the lineamientos process having begun, and even compare it with my forecasts of 2 years ago. When I thought about doing that, I was a little bit worried. I thought I might have to sort of confess how badly I'd done, but in fact, we're pretty much on target. It's very, very close. So I'm quite pleased to have been able to anticipate these. But there are differences, and there are important differences from what I expected 2 years ago and what's actually turned out. And I'd like to explore those a little bit, to the extent to which events have surprised us. Okay? So what I'm going to do, I've got 8 slides, and they're all charts. So what I'm doing is looking at the data to see what's in there. My analysis is mainly done from outside Cuba. I'm handling the data and obsessing about finding out what's in there, what's missing, and what it all means. Okay, now chart number 1, exhibit number 1 is about the GDP performance. Well, it's about GDP performance and what's driving GDP. And so we've got the period since 2000 to 2013. The 2013 is clearly an estimate. And on the right, there's highlighting what's happened since the lineamientos started. So what's happened that's different from before. First of all, we can see the GDP figures. And we can see that surge in the middle of the decade when the Venezuelan relationship blossomed. And then you've got the stagnation, you've got the problems from 2008 to 9, and you've got not much of an acceleration since. It's quite disappointing. That's a disappointment. I forecast an average for 2011 to 12 of 3.9, and the outturn was only 3, which isn't that far out, but I was a bit on the optimistic side, and we'll look at why. The next slide I'm going to do is look at the drivers, and I'm going to look at private consumption. It's on the expenditure side of the national income accounts. Private consumption, government consumption, gross fixed investment, and on the export side. But what I'm doing is not actually tracing the percentage growth of them, but I'm tracing the percentage difference from GDP growth. In other words, were they driving growth or were they dragging growth? So for example, let's take the first one. Let's just explain how you read it. If it's above 0, it's one of the drivers. Yeah? If it's below 0, it's dragging it down. Okay? So that's private consumption, according to the government's figures. We know that there are problems with them. But the picture does actually seem to reflect what's been going on. On the whole, if you added up the area underneath and you added up the area above, you'll see that it was actually a drag. The private consumption hasn't been growing as much as GDP growth. But what you have in 2013, I'm anticipating that there's going to start to be a recovery. The recovery hasn't happened yet. It didn't happen in 2011, 2012. And that's evident in household consumption. If we look at government consumption, we've got government consumption that, since the lineamientos began, have been a drag. So government consumption has actually been rising less strongly than GDP. In fact, it's actually been falling. So there's been retrenchment in the government sector, as we anticipated, because that's part of what's been going on. Gross fixed investment is much more volatile. It always is. And you can see the surge, which was financed by the Venezuela relationship, and then the slump when there was adjustment post-2008 difficulties, which were caused by the hurricanes, but also by a slow reaction to a deterioration in terms of trade. And so there was a huge adjustment in 2009. And there's been an improvement since. And during the period of the lineamientos, we have had investment now leading, yeah? Markedly leading. And this investment is of a different type from the previous investment. So I think there is more productive investment beginning to happen. But it has consistently, the growth rate of investment has consistently come in lower than planned. And it was indeed lower than I anticipated in my forecast. So there's been a problem there. It hasn't been possible to increase investment to the extent that the government had hoped. And the reasons for that is that the lineamientos haven't brought an increase in productivity on the scale of what was hoped. The 2013 picture, the figure I've got there, 15%, is half of what the government's target is. I don't know how they're doing so far, and it'll be interesting to see at the end of the year. On the export side, the exports, of course, was a huge surge from the Venezuela relationship because that was exports of goods and services, and so there was this surge in the new income stream from doctors. And you can see that the current slight pickup in GDP has not been caused by, it's not been investment, not been export driven. Okay, so we start to see a picture emerging here, particularly of the investment pickup beginning to happen, but not happening as much as it should have done. In the next slide, so from an export and consumption-driven growth to investment-led growth, but still a particularly low base, and Juan already showed you that picture of how low it is, around 10, 12% of GDP, which is terribly, terribly low. In Latin America, it's between 20 and 25 on average, and then if you go to the Asian countries, it's over 40%. You know, Cuba's not even replacing its own capital still. Okay, now switching to the structural side, so we're going to the supply side, looking at the output elements. Again, there's the same GDP picture, and I'm going to do the same thing. The difference between the growth and the GDP growth. I'm going more quickly here, but watch agriculture has been incredibly disappointing, given that the reforms have been introduced in agriculture more than anywhere else. Why that is interesting, and there's a lot of exploration of why that's happening. But the idea, the expectation that it would be easy to increase agricultural productivity merely by privatising it or to make people grow their own food, it was a misplaced expectation. There's a whole lot more to increasing agricultural productivity than merely the question of ownership of the land. The mining picture is very volatile at the beginning. There was some changes in the nickel price early on, which meant that in 2001 there was a decline. But it's actually, overall, over the decade, showing stagnation. There's been long-awaited investment there that hasn't materialised. But mining is only a short proportion of the total. A small proportion of the total. Moving to construction, you can see a pattern here beginning to emerge of construction like investment. Obviously, construction and investment are associated with each other. And so you can see construction picking up as well. Manufacturing is more important because it's a bigger share of GDP, and you can see it's just tipping up to become a positive driver for growth. But it's not a very strong one, but it's an important one because, of course, manufacturing is a huge employer, and in the long run, to have a manufacturing base in order to reduce import dependency is hugely important. And finally, the services figure. Now, you have to be careful with watching this one. Remember, services is 3/4 of GDP is services. So when services is above the zero line, it pulls up much more than the others. And when it's below, it pulls down much more. And what we've got here, so that orange line is quite difficult, it gets tangled up at the end. But you can see, whereas before it has been above the line, it's been driving growth. It's now actually lagging. So we're switching from services-led growth to the other sectors, and in particular, construction, investment-driven growth. So something is happening. There has been some kind of a turning point economically. So shifted from services to construction and manufacturing, but particularly elusive manufacturing, agricultural sector. Now the two next slides are much quicker. And the first one's looking at stability, and the measure of economic stability is usually prices. And of course, in Cuba, the prices are very, very difficult to measure. They're very, very odd. They work in a completely different way. You've got the dual currency, you've got control prices, you've got different markets. And so measuring any index of prices is incredibly difficult. And so I'm going to go through this slide quite quickly because I'm not sure how much you can really read from it, because it's based on baskets of goods, which unless you understand exactly what's in the baskets and what's omitted, you can't really tell that much. So, and the figures only got up to 2011. We haven't got one for 2012. And I'm not even hazarding a guess for 2013. So there's two indicators here. There's a GDP deflator, which is what you're supposed to adjust the nominal GDP by in order to get the real GDP growth, and the CPI, which is the Consumer Prices Index, which is supposed to be what households face. And this is how they behave. That's the GDP deflator, very volatile. And then if you look at the CPI, it seems to be starting to move more closely, but they're a long way away from each other in general. And like I say, I wouldn't really put too much store by them. But what you can see here is if you look at the scale, -4 to 12, the average inflation rate in Cuba, whichever way you measure it, is low. I mean, it's not high at all. And for a country and economy going through such huge structural changes, it's actually a very low exchange rate, inflation rate. And therefore you can see that in order to keep it that low, the government has had to restrain monetary growth throughout this period. So there's a very tight control of monetary emission, very tight control of credit in this time, which is part of, when I was talking about the risks, one of the risks is strangulation of growth by over-excessive inflation control or fear of instability. So there's a question mark there. Is that one of the reasons, actually, why the economy hasn't been able to grow? Why profitable, sound state enterprises haven't been able to invest, they haven't been able to borrow, there's no credit for them, and of course the private sector, there's no credit there, well, very, very little credit there for people to expand their businesses. And the next one looks at employment. Now I'm just going to put up the chart there. This is the official unemployment rate. And what's a couple of things interesting there. The low level of official unemployment in the 2007, 8, 9. I mean, less than 2% is considered to be, overemployment generally in most economies, because you haven't even got enough people for frictional to move between jobs. You'll start to encounter labour shortages if unemployment level is that low. You don't have a pool of workers to draw from. But of course, the official unemployment level in Cuba is no measure of the extent to which you've got slackness in the labour market. And that can be seen here. You've got the unemployment rate rising while economic growth is picking up. Well, that's not the way around it's supposed to be. But the unemployment rate is rising because the government is no longer trying to pretend that it doesn't exist. And so it's actually the target for unemployment in 2013 was declared to be higher than it was in 2012, even though 2012 had overshot the expectation. And I think that's significant. It's a statement that the government is no longer guaranteeing work, and that it expects that an unemployment rate of higher than that should exist. But unemployment, as I say, is a very, very difficult one to do, because working outside the state sector is, in many cases, more lucrative than being in the state sector. So people don't even want jobs in the state sector often. So it's a difficult thing. How much time have I got?
No, you're doing great.
Good. Okay. I'm on number 5 of 10. Okay. So it's the end of the employment guarantee, and that's really significant, and that's a huge cultural shift. It's a huge change in the way people think of themselves in relation to the state and in relation to work. I say it's huge. A lot of people haven't changed the way they think. It takes a long time for that really to hit home. But it's something that's beginning to happen. So when you say not that much has happened in terms of reform so far, what has happened is a change in the way people talk about themselves in relation to the state. Now I'm going to go to the external sector, which Juan also talked about. I'm going to take in 3 parts. So I'm going to look at the goods trade, the services trade, and then the balance of payments as a whole, and see what we can see from all 3 of those and what's happened in the last couple of years. And here we've got total exports have not grown, as this is goods exports. This is measured in in million US dollars, so it's not real. You have to take into account the terms of trade, but there doesn't seem to be any sign in particular of the goods trade picking up under these conditions yet. And meanwhile, the imports are having been adjusted very, very sharply in 2009 in order to begin to pay off the debts. They've expanded a lot. And so, of course, you have a huge, well, a large deficit on the goods side. Now, I don't subscribe to the idea that there's anything wrong with that, actually, because Cuba's a services-dominated economy, and if you're a services-dominated economy with a large services export, you will have a goods deficit. You should have a goods deficit. It would be very strange and counterproductive to try to eliminate the deficit. Because if you're earning money on services, you're going to be importing goods with the money that you earn from services. It makes sense. What is worrying is the degree to which on the export side, there hasn't been diversification. So you've still got exports very heavily dominated by nickel, and then way further down, you've got nickel, medicines, sugar, and others, accounting for most of them, except this new element that's come in, which is oil exports, which is the relationship with Venezuela, and it looks like a lot of that is the earnings from the oil refinery. So you have to adjust now, when you're reading those accounts, to try to deduct that trade from both sides, because of course that's not all value added. So the exports have to be, a lot of it has to be paid for in terms of oil coming in. It's very, very difficult to see how much net earnings they're getting from that one. Okay. Oh, you said I was doing that. Okay, services trade. There's the tourism figure. You can see that quite stagnant for the past decade, really. And then you've got the non-tourism bit, and that's the huge kind of unknown within the accounts, because there's no other explanation of what that is. And there's all sorts of things gone in there which we don't really know about. Of course, we know about the doctors. We don't know how much Cubans are getting from licensing pharmaceuticals, and we don't know exactly the price that the Cubans are paying and how much they're borrowing to pay that either. We'll come to that in the balance payments. So there's the services imports, and so the services balance is large and positive. And in the next slide, so well, you can see that it didn't increase anymore in the last couple of years. So that surge is over. If we go on to the current account balances, we've got the goods balance, the services balance, as I've just shown you, and you've got the goods and services balance, which is slightly positive. So, you know, that in itself is okay. Then you've got the incomes balances, which is interest and profits, some of that on the nickel, and some of that is interest that they're paying on debt. And then you've got this odd one, which is current transfers, which is very, very odd. You can see it goes negative in 2005, net current transfers. That includes remittances, so what's going on there? And it seems that the Cubans are accounting some of the income they're getting from the sale of doctors is to pay for Cuban aid to Bolivia, and so they count that as an external, a negative current transfer. It's like them giving aid. And so you can't see what's happening to remittances at all anymore, because all we ever had was the net figure. Again, very difficult to read. And so you have a current account figure that looks like this. Very, very close to balance. Now that raises a lot of important questions. How do you explain they've got a current account in balance, but they have capital coming in? Right? If they're borrowing to pay for the oil, if they've got foreign direct investment coming in for the Mariel construction and other infrastructure projects, that should mean, probably, that there's an accumulation of reserves happening there. It may not be. They may be using it to repay debt. One or the other. We don't know. We don't know any of that because the figures aren't published. Although there is somebody in the room who might know a little bit more than I do about this, because those figures are published, but the central bank certainly has them. So what's going on? We don't know. I think that there may be an increase in reserves, and I think that it may be something to do with preparing for the next big shock in Cuba, which is the exchange rate adjustment. We don't know when that's going to happen, but if it was going to happen, they would have to accumulate reserves. That's all we know. So here's some questions. This is my final slide. And so I've just put five questions to you, and then I want, obviously, you to fire 100 back. Right, there's been a shift from unsustainable services export surge to investment-driven adjustment, as we saw. Is it enough? The investment level is still far too low, and it's proved harder than we thought to increase productivity. Second, and related, there's a disappointing first results in agriculture in an output. And this is an interesting one. Some people suggested that agriculture was inefficient because it was state-owned, that it would be easy to raise productivity. We should have possibly learned the difficulties of it by watching other countries going through huge changes. The problems are harder to overcome than we expected, and there's a huge institutional development that I'm sure that people are going to talk about today that's got to surround those reforms in order to make them work. Third, there are huge distortions still there. You can't have a use of the market mechanism creating an efficient economy if you don't have the price mechanism operating with prices that reflect relative scarcities. So huge distortions still exist. Is it possible to make, how much transformation can you make, how much liberalisation, how much expansion of the role of the market can you do until you've had the exchange rate unification? Trade reorientation is needed urgently, so I said that it's hugely over-specialised, and of course the dependence on Venezuela is enormous. So the question is, where's this going to come from? This is really, it seems to me that Cuban minds are very sharply focused on this question at the moment. And there are certainly things happening there in searching for new partners and new ways of selling particularly their services. Exchange rate adjustment is key. Is it on its way? I think so. Don't know when and don't know how.
Thank you, Emily. Gracias. No change in the program. We're going to have Adrian Hearn. Since we're dealing with the external sector, Adrian Hearn is going to talk about China now and the China impact in Cuba, and I will be last. Your data, you said you do not have access to Cuban data, so what do you use?
Oh, I use the ONE data. Yeah.
International Economist Unit, Intelligence Unit.
I know the Oficina Nacional de Estadística.
Oh, the ONE.
Yeah. And then where there are gaps, I estimate them. And so in the paper, there will be lots and lots of footnotes.
You don't use Economist data. I mean, you used to work for the time for many years.
Well, the economists use the ONE data.
They also use the ONE.
He did the economist. She is the economist.
Bueno, muchas gracias a todos. Yo pensé hablar en español como, bueno, la mayoría de los ponentes hablan español. Pensé que sería más lógico. Lo puedo hacer en inglés si prefieren, no sé.
I think since there are a few people who probably prefer in English, right? Maybe it is better in English. Yeah, I see a couple of nodding faces, so maybe English.
Okay, then we'll switch to English.
Native in English language anyway.
Cierto.
Cierto, vamos a ver cómo va.
Okay, so we'll, the slides, there's not many slides, but they're in Spanish. It doesn't matter, we can translate if we need to.
And you're going to say Spanish with the Australian accent?
Well, probably more of a Cuban accent, because that's where I learned to speak Spanish.
I don't know.
So, and besides, I'm actually not from Australia. But speaking of Australia, I do work there, and I work in the China Studies Centre in the University of Sydney. And the reason I moved to Australia is precisely because in Australia, the expertise on China is actually quite high, good quality. And Australia has a very close relationship with China, not always positive, to an extent dependent on our natural resource exports. But having lived in Cuba, this is one of the reasons why now I look at China-Cuba relations. It's, that's why I live in Australia. And I think there's some relevance, actually, as you look around the world and see China's impact. Being based in Australia is quite useful. So, yeah, I've been in Cuba for about 3 years looking at China's impact since about the year 2000, when I began living there. And so really the idea today that I want to talk about is both from the macro level to understand the relationship, the international relationship, but then to zoom into the local level and try to see what this means for human impact, what it means for everyday people. So we'll begin then at the macro level. This is Chinese trade with Cuba, 1992 to 2011. Those are the most recent UN Comtrade numbers. And you can see there the very quick growth in trade between the two, from about $314 million in 2000 to close to $2 billion in 2011. The highest point was just before the GFC, when most sources coincide on about $2.3 billion in bilateral trade. And you know, the agreements between Cuba and China span a range of sectors. So we're talking about everything from, as Emily mentioned, nickel, petroleum, through to things like this, the transport sector. Of course, this is to replace the old camellos, which people had had enough of, and this is reflected then in the Cuban purchase of Chinese buses. 400 buses were purchased in 2005, and then another 1,000 buses purchased in 2008. This has been actually a complicated process, but I won't go into the politics of it now. I think it is worth mentioning that these kinds of trade interactions have been accompanied by some pretty intensive dialogue with China about how the economy can develop and what paths of development are viable for Cuba. And this is really evident ever since 1995, when Fidel Castro visited Beijing and met the Prime Minister Li Peng, who really advised him in no uncertain terms that the best path for Cuba would be to open up the economy. And so that, that's now 20 years ago, and it's taken a while for that advice to kind of sink in, but the advice has been coming from China constantly since then. Now, in terms of how much the advice is being listened to, well, you have a range of opinions on that. We have commentators such as Jose Azel, who unequivocally believes that nothing much is going to change in Cuba. La situación no cambiará mucho. And this was a comment in relation to the lineamientos. But then, on the other hand, you have the Center for Democracy in Latin America here in DC. And I've translated it. I don't know the original quote in English now, but un importante reajuste de la relación paternalista que ha existido entre el Estado y la ciudadanía. So an important adjustment in the paternalistic relationship between the state and citizenry. And then, because of this deepening relationship between the two, we have a comment from someone we all know, Richard Feinberg, who believes that, well, because of the growing interest of China in Cuba, many specialists believe that China se ha convertido en la FMI de Cuba, which is not an official, this is sort of an impressions that Richard, I think, has observed. Muy fuerte.
Yeah, very strong.
I think, despite the differences between Cuba and China, it is possible to identify some points in common in the reform processes that are playing out in both countries. In both cases, the national politics have been formulated after running localized, smaller scale experiments. So sort of learning from experience as the reforms set in. And excuse me for using the word reforms, it's just the easiest English translation of cambios. It's probably easy. And the idea in both cases is to try to liberalize the economy, but under the hegemony of the state. And an interesting article in Demas recently by a Chinese scholar saying exactly that that's their advice for Cuba, to maintain the hegemony of the state in order to liberalize the economy. I think if there's something that China has advanced further than Cuba, and Juan Triana makes this point in an article in Espacio Laical, he says really the thing that Cuba needs to do more of is to take advantage of the country's human resources, high levels of education, high levels of training, really a tremendous resource for the development of the country. And I think the way Juan puts it is, it would be a real lost opportunity if that doesn't become the case. So it's logical then that Cuba would speak with China about these kinds of things, and this is reflected in the frequent to and fro of high-level officials between the two. I think an important moment was, an often overlooked moment, was in November 2010 when Ricardo Alarcón visited Beijing and explicitly said, well, I think that the Chinese model of development has great relevance for what we're trying to do in Cuba. He's not the first person to say that. And in Raúl Castro and his visits in 1997, 2005, and 2012 clearly had a similar approach, thinking along the same lines, and for that reason focused his visits on reforming the labor market and the way that China has gone about reforming labor, the creation of hybrid structures, and really the creation of state-owned enterprises that are able to incorporate, to a greater extent, private activity and interlink between SOEs and private providers, private actors. And of course, that flow, those visits have come back in the other direction. So we have the previous vice president of China, now the president, Xi Jinping, who visited Havana in June 2011, together with the president of CNPC, that's the China National Petroleum Corporation. And what they did was not only sign investment and trade agreements, but also spoke at some length with the Cuban leadership about finance and ways to frame the broader economic development of the country. If we look at the investment numbers, well, the Heritage Foundation on its famous China investment tracker has $5 billion of Chinese investment in Cuba. And it says that 4.5 of that is in energy, in other words, oil. And so we're really looking then at the refinery in Cienfuegos, and we're looking at probably, although the foundation doesn't say so, exploration activities off the north of Cuba. And this really is, I think, what underlines Richard Feinberg's comment there. I think there are certainly some lessons then that Cuba has taken on board from China, or is studying. Forgive me, they're in Spanish, but you can see the coordinación de sectores industriales, the gradual sequencing of changes, the adaptation of socialist principles to national conditions, the role of the military in advancing the economy, the attraction of foreign investment for immigrants. This is something that we now know is of a great deal of interest to the Cuban government, and trying out strategies of liberalization in small-scale experiments before they are scaled up. Now, I want to have a look then at that last point, this experimentation and then scaling up of experimentation. And I'm an anthropologist, and so I really do try to focus in on this kind of local human dimension. I want to look then briefly at the case of Chinatown, Barrio Chino de La Habana, because I think there are some lessons there that sort of indicate the broader trajectory of development in the country. Some of the struggles they're having there in opening up the economy, but at the same time, they're, in my view, one step ahead of much of the rest of the country. So we all know Barrio Chino, this is the Portico. 2006 was the year that the Office of the Historian officially took control of the administration of Barrio Chino. Back in 1994, a group of Chinese descendants of the local Cuban Chinese community put together a group called the Grupo Promotor de Barrio Chino, and they were able to lobby the government of Centro Habana. Barrio Chino there is just to the left of the Capitolio, which you can see the red sort of shape in the middle there, the oval shape. So they lobbied the government of Centro Habana to allow them to set up small stores to sell shoes, cooking items, and clothes. And these items were imported directly from China. They were given this authority to not just set up small stores, and this was the first instance in Cuba where this happened, but also to develop direct commercial linkages with China. I think one of the interesting areas to look at here is the development of the restaurant sector in Barrio Chino. So, Chinese restaurants are sort of ubiquitous around the world, but if we consider the way they've developed in Cuba, they show some really interesting signs of the challenges that lie ahead more broadly. So I interviewed 9 restaurant owners between 2011 and this year. I was just in Havana a couple of weeks ago doing this. And most of them report that they're making between $3,000 and $5,000 a day. So this is significant money. This is more than other sectors, and this is, to an extent, private money. I won't go into detail now about what they do with this money. That's, if you're interested, I have an article in China Quarterly that looks in detail at this. But for now, let's just consider that there are 2 kinds of restaurants. There are these ones, the ones in the famous Callejón de Cuchillo. These are the ones that were set up originally by the Grupo Promotor in the 90s, and since then have become under the control of the Office of the Historian. And by the way, the Office of the Historian is very meticulous about the taxation of these restaurants. That's one kind. Another kind are these ones, the restaurants that are connected to the associations, the traditional Chinese associations. These are not subject to the same taxes as the other ones, to the Office of the Historian. These are directly below the authority of the Ministry of Justice, and they have to submit their profits to the Ministry of Justice. But the difference between the two, I think, is interesting if we consider the way small businesses are developing throughout Cuba. So those that are subjected to the Office of the Historian's taxes, they are more transparent. They're able to show their books more openly now. But the trouble is the taxes are so high that they are barely viable. They're hardly able to function, to hire people. And this has been, if you talk to the owners, a real disaster. But then if you talk to the ones like these ones that are below the Ministry of Justice, those are the ones that are doing very well. Now, this is sort of paradoxical because they have to submit all of their profits to the Ministry of Justice. The key to understanding this is the words have to, right? Because actually most of them don't. They've got various informal ways of holding on to the money that they make, and they privately, that is, por la izquierda, invest this money in hiring staff, in upgrading their kitchens, and running their businesses. So what's fundamental then is to come to some sort of balance, right, between this kind of top-down taxation and upward entrepreneurship. And I think this, the lineamiento 3 is key here. The famous statement, en las formas de gestión no estatales no se permitirá la concentración de la propiedad en personas jurídicas o naturales. So this is a difficult balance, obviously, to come to. This is ambiguous for this reason, because no one knows quite how to define that line of what's permitted and what's not. I think we can conclude that the cambios in Cuba are moving to a situation, and I think Emily indicated this, of greater private participation in the economy, to an extent, I wouldn't call it a retrenchment, but perhaps less focus on the state's role. But at the same time, I believe that there's a consensus within Cuba and outside that the ideal situation would be a balance of a kind of mixed enterprise situation. And we see this reflected in other countries too. That this is, at this point in the history of global economics, a good way forward, to find new ways of linking state enterprises to the private sector. And I think actually China's rise has got a lot to do with this. I wouldn't call it yet a consensus, but growing awareness of that possibility. The Chinese government obviously has a stake in the success of the Cuban reforms, and China obviously could be an important source of the credits that Emily mentioned that Cuban entrepreneurs need. That's not yet the case, but it could become the case. And I just want to end with this point. This is someone I've known for about 10 years now. He now runs this sort of little kiosco where he vends plomeria, he sells parts for kitchens, bathrooms. And you know, what he tells me and others when I ask him where do you get your materials from? He says, well, I get them, 60% of it comes from el socio que tengo en la bodega, or en la fábrica. In other words, it's still the case that the supply chain is informal, largely informal. And this is the key thing going forwards, the supply chain. Because without that supply chain, it's not possible to open up a broader range of frontline economic activity. And much of the argument that we hear out of Miami especially, and to an extent out of DC, is that the Cuban government should open up a wider range of frontline retail and economic activity. But the problem is, unless the supply chain is established first, then that's going to actually cause an increase in the black market. So the supply chain has to be dealt with first. It's really important to remember that. I think the investments from Brazil and China in the port of Mariel are important in this regard. It signals a greater integration, the possibility of bringing in intermediate goods from overseas. And, you know, in the end, I think considering this sort of human angle and the impact that these processes have on people like my friend here are going to provide a really important window into understanding the human dimension and really the reality of los cambios cubanos. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
Since we're running a bit out of time, given that we have another full presentation this morning, I will really have to rush to my own. Is that up? Bear with me, and I'll make the main points. You'll get them, and they're very simple. How do you do this? So this is an attempt to look back at what Juan Triana, he said he was an economic historian, and he kind of is urging us to look back, and I'm taking his advice and going back to history, especially after 1959, and make some basic points. From history from the shifts in the previous economic models or inflections in the model throughout since the beginning, to then making some kind of a statement about what is the likelihood that the reforms since 2008 will continue to deepen. Well, the authorities are serious. They have baptized the policies, actualización, or the model, the path to a new model. They have defined objectives, lineamientos. I think there's more to come, perhaps after 2015, as one pointed out. They have defined a tempo, rhythm, sin prisa pero sin pausa. How do you translate that into English? Slow, but I don't know, just slowly but surely. There we go. And they have added complementary measures in migration, expansion of tourism, new ports in Mariel, the international scene, China, etc. So you all know about the hare and the hicotea, right? About the tortoise and the hare, right? You know that story in Cuba? Esopo, la fábula de Esopo, que there's a battle or a competition between a tortoise and a hare to who will finish first. And of course, here's the conejo, the hare, kind of presumed to win, and we put a Soviet hat on the conejo, the Soviet bloc. So will Raúl Castro's approach to reform be like the fabled tortoise that in the end beat the hare's big bang, allow me for the to the finish line? So as we know, the dual transition in the Eastern Bloc, Soviet communism, whatever you want to call it, had many problems, series of crises for 10, 12 years, and it's now perhaps beginning to, in some places, make sense. In others, there's still question and backlashes. And I think the consensus is that there have been problems. So in the end, the gradual path makes sense. Well, Cuba evade the problems of the double transition of the Soviet bloc. And I think that's a little, there it is, that's a question mark. Will Cuba really make it or not? Well, what I do here, this presentation tries to develop, and by the way, this is a project at the Bildner Center, the Cuba project. We want to develop an analytical narrative of past episodes of reform. We want to analyze those shifts in historical moments and to explore prospects of the future. Very fast, very rapid overview from 1970 of data from 70 on. It's amazing that from 70 to 1990, there was sustained growth really, except for 1980. And I'll go back to, if there's time in the question and answer period, I'd like to go back to why 1980 there was a dip, 1881. And then of course the collapse of socialism, 89-90, contraction in all sectors. And then you begin to see an expansion after that, and especially in services. We have already covered this. I mean, I want to call your attention to the sustained growth, more or less, between 70 and 85. Growth rate uneven, the 80 negative, and then the 90s, the early 90s, periodo especial, very negative, contraction of 30. Official data, 35%, perhaps a bit more, depending on what assumptions you made. To analyze those shifts, we don't have time for this here. Again, we have a project, and I'd like to go back to this, and we will convene some of you to help us do this in future events here. We want to go back to the debates between Mesalago and the economists in Cuba, Jose Rodriguez, and also Carmelo was codified many of the, he needs to be acknowledged, because he did codify the sequence of 5 stages that I want to move toward in just a second. And then he also had the gumption and the ability to engage in very effective debate with specialists from Cuba, Jose Rodriguez, Temas, European economists, UNDP specialists, and others. Too bad Carmelo cannot be here today. He might have been here today. We look forward to having him on board in the future. Again, he's been here 2, 3, 4 times. Again, the 5 big moments, and this is my own, based on the previous work, but my own simplification, the 60s, what I call the long 70s, 71 to 85, or 70 if you wish, if you will, and then rectification, which I think is very important, and then post-Soviet era, special period. I subdivided it into 2, which is 1997. I call that the true special period. And I do want to call your attention to what I see as socialist reaffirmation between after 97, 98. And then, of course, the reaffirmation of reform in 2008. Essentially, there's a reform, there's a shift between 70 and 71. I'm ignoring the 60s. The model of institutionalized is maintained through 85. And then 86, when rectification seems to be a backward step, back to the ideas that we'll briefly review next. And then a period of confusion, bewilderment, adjustment. You can use different phrases, special period, some reforms, and then some beginnings of what I think is a reaffirmation of some forms of orthodoxy after 1998. And then the current phase. The 60s, we don't have time to review this. You know, most of you know this history. There's actually a lot of debate within a lot of shifts in Cuba, but essentially you have, in my view, they can be neatly summarized in terms of the debate between Carlos Rodriguez and Che Guevara on the issues of material versus moral incentives. And I do think this is worth going back, because what I fear is that whether or not we might have a tendency to go back to the same issues that we faced in the past. As you know, Che Guevara defended moral incentives, and then the revolutionary offensive of '68 nationalized the Cuban system, state socialism to one of the most kind of centralized in history. So some of the institutions that are formed, the plan, ministries, the nationalization drive through the early 60s. By 1968, essentially the entire Cuban economy was in the hands of the state. Minor, just a few farmers and others were not part of the state system. some of the cooperative, we'll go back to cooperative, we have session here later today. Of course, Carlos Rafael was at first at Inca and then at Indra, and then he was playing different roles, including, again, the synthesizing the debate. We don't have time for more. We promise another event here where we'll do this in serious depth that it deserves. Che Guevara, the new man, idealism before pragmatism, based on the sense of duty, patriotism, solidarity, and collective interest. Therefore, an appeal to moral incentive and to a claim that Cuba could go into complete to a phase of building communism, unlike the Soviet Union, which was presumed to be at an even perhaps earlier stage. So Cuba thought that he could jump, and that comes from the ideas of Che and people like him in Cuba at the time. Socialization, so education and social services. It's more than socialization. It was the main function of the state to get the masses involved in the process. And it's a question of building centralization. Now, Carlos Rafael Rodriguez, by the way, I was reminded by Lázaro Peña that May 13 is the 100 years of his birth. Carlos Rafael, as you know, was a very prominent Cuban intellectual, professor at the University of Havana, trained at the University of Havana, great economist, and he played a key role in steering Cuba painfully, with a lot of tension, with a lot of, in my view, toward the alignment with the Soviet Union. Closer than it perhaps it might have been without his persistent role that they played. His Carlos Rafael, simplifying, was into market mechanisms, Soviet model, and material incentives. So a big clash between the two models of socialism, right? The road to Cuba. So a little bit more on the Guevarista model, which is, again, with money would eventually disappear in some as a medium of exchange, but not as a unit of account, elimination of economic incentives, price controls, etc. The 60s did not work out as people hoped, people hoped. And there was declining output. There was a crisis in 1970 of sugar production. We all know, we have read about this thing. The economy grew by only 0.4% between 66 and 70, increasing trade deficits with the USSR, lower worker productivity, and some of the same variables that we are now discussing with them in their presentations. Shortages of ration goods and services and monetary overhang, the same one that we have now. Perhaps now we have even worse, maybe. And maybe Cyrus will tell us about the monetary overhang and some aspects of it. So, 75, you have, against essentially some version of the Carlos Rafael Rodriguez story wins out as some version, not necessarily what he wanted. You have institutionalization. You have the development of you have the first party Congress in 1975. You have the Constitution in 1976. You have the Poder Popular shortly around those period, and then you have other developments happening that are very key. The Africa campaigns, the 70s reinforcing the armed forces, which becomes a key institution. So the parties strengthen, the armed forces are strengthened, and then the Second Congress is part of this model. The new economic management and planning system, and then adopted from the Soviets, where we had a very interesting Cuban economist, Alberto Perez, who led that for many years, and he did a very credible job. Remember those figures of sustained growth. There was a creation of farmers market, not unlike the recent past, liberalization of consumption, select goods, parallel markets, material incentives, wage and pricing policy changes. Cuban Americans also rise to visit Cuba. So it's a lot of change in the 70s. Not too different from what is going on now, right? So how far can we go? So the 70 to 85, again, sustained growth except for 1980. And Juan is going to tell me later what happened in 1980 in Cuba. Why the dip, 80-81? Why the dip? You see that in 1980, 81, there's negative growth. And I think it has to do with the Soviet...
Since the beginning of the recession in Cuba and the final of the special growth model in Cuba, extensive growth model in Cuba.
but it bounces right back. And if you look at the slope of the line, essentially retains the same, the same slope as before. So they overcome the crisis. But we can go over that in question and answer. And then you have, so the way looking at this from the outside, as Emily pointed out, or one of you preceded me, we have looking at. It seems to me that rectificación is again back to some kind of fundamentalism, to use the term. You have a third Congress of the Communist Party in 1986, which launches rectificación. Very strong speeches. The Congress lasts the whole year from February to December. Opens and then closes, and in December, Fidel Castro makes a series of very important speeches and very strong speeches that year, in July and in April and later. And I guess essentially he rejects the Soviet model. Again, this is Gorbachev. He rejects all that, and he advances a strong critique of bureaucracy and planning, on ongoing reforms about trade incentives and farmers' market. He just demolishes those things. He wants to return to volunteer work, agrarian collectivization, rekindling of moral incentives, and he doesn't want to abolish the whole thing. He just has a very strong reaffirmation of the old values. And of course, his own personal leadership. Here are some phrases from him, taken from the article by Jose Luis Rodriguez, written shortly after. No system, and again, the emphasis on ideology, the consciousness, political aspects, individualistic interests are no match for communal. There are now speculators and middlemen, according to Fidel, who should be neutralized. Corruption, the whole discussion of corruption, very similar to the current one. Perhaps technocracy without consideration of political social impact. So he's resenting technocracy that is not really looking at politics and social context, which is what he would like for Cuba to do, to reassert. He says that the Soviet model was assimilated uncritically, and that there is weakness in the administration, there's indolence, lack of discipline, corruption, and the economic mechanisms ignore political factors in construction of socialism. So Fidel begins to move toward a different model. And of course, Humberto Perez has to resign in 84, right? 84, 85. So we have in the academic world in the U.S. and Cuba and elsewhere, we have various statements on why rectificación. Mesalago says ideology. Rodriguez, Jose Luis says he's focused on economic problems, the crisis since 1980, and so on. Leon, Francisco Leon, Pancho Leon, he says there's a focus on economic problems, as well as this feeling that Cuba was the vanguard of internationalism. Cuba was a true thing. Cuba was a true communist movement and a leader in the world. And that's what he likes to emphasize. Marifeli is eclectic. Dominguez has a series of statements, also linking interestingly to the issue of the armed forces. And then you have various other statements. Again, we want to have a session here in a few weeks to address those debates of the past. So 85, 84, 85 are years of some tension, dismissals, Ramiro Valdez, Roberto Perez, the party. There are all different reasons, but then there's a new version of the debt crisis, and then the issue of what to do with that, and that tends to support people who emphasize an explanation based on economics. And of course, Cuba is still receiving help from the Soviet bloc, and is able to prevent crisis and keep growing actually from 1989. Please maintain where it was. Then the big collapse. Special period, dissolution of CUNY, or the Soviet bloc, Fourth Congress of the Communist Party, 91. These are the key moments, embargo, etc., Constitutional Amendment of 92. We have a period of adjustment, essentially, trying to adjust to a very difficult external shock, as Juan pointed out. Look what happens to sugar. critical sector. We have a great Cuba panel later on today. And the Cuban economy, which had ups and downs throughout from the 60s through 1890, collapses. And by 2005, it is just a shadow of its former self. It's just gone. Cuba had been perhaps the key producer, and it loses. Who does it lose to? Who is the winner of Cuba's? Who occupies Cuba's place in the world scene? Brazil, São Paulo. If I were to keep projecting the São Paulo, the Brazil figure up, the Cuba figures would diminish because São Paulo explodes to 20-some million tons of sugar. So Brazil really takes over the sugar business and is a key leader in that. That's a major episode that points to the problems that key industry in Cuba, sugar, again, had during this period. And again, we want to go back to that later today. It's a very exciting panel. I think that the period after 1996, 97 is socialist reformation. You have the Fifth Congress, which is kind of the way I read it from the outside. It's trying to make sense of a difficult moment. You have Hellsburn in 96. You have the battle of ideas is a key thing that I'd like to emphasize. Elian Gonzalez in 99, Chavez in 98 elected, and then he starts his presidency in 98, and then 2000 no, he starts in 1999. He wins the election in 98, and then he's reelected, and Venezuela becomes a key partner for Cuba. And then Fidel Castro's illness, and then that closes that period that I call socialist reformation. And then Fidel reassumes La Batuta. He wants cooperation agreements with Venezuela, reformation of socialist ideology. The socialism is irreversible. Constitutional revision in 2002, in which it says that much: the socialism is there to stay, and Cuba will never again return to capitalism. And it prohibits negotiations, presumably with the U.S., so long as there's aggression, threat, or coercion from a foreign power. Again, I'm rushing through this. So actualización. You already have enough. You already heard enough on actualización. There's a Sixth Congress of the Communist Party in 2011, formalizes the concept. Then the key elements, we went through them. Well, we need to. I have to do much of this. But I do notice that it's very significant in terms of, it's like a throwback to market mechanisms, pragmatism, liberalization. So what is going on in Cuban history? With what sense do we make of those periods of advancement in one direction, then going in the other direction, and then back to the first direction, and then back to the other? Will Cuba return to a moment of reaffirmation of orthodox socialism? You have different views on current reforms. I personally think there's a broad debate, which is very healthy, and what we're doing here today is part of that. We have, and I hope this intensifies within Cuba, and the conditions exist for many Cuban economies, all Cuban economies, to continue to express their views and travel abroad and publish extensively on these issues. Because the nation does need, and as Raúl Castro himself pointed out throughout this whole entire process, debate and inputs from all sectors of society. I think publications like Temas, especially like Cal, and academic books are fundamental sources and I'd like to see actually more of this. Conferences like the ones we do here and others do are important. So more debate is needed on this set of issues. I think I'd like to close with just making 5 propositions based on, again, the Jicotea and the Conejo, no? Is the Jicotea is going to win or not? Perhaps. I didn't want it in Aesop's version of the story. But it didn't work out this time, Aesop's, right? Well, it is disconcerting that there seems to be, again, looking from the outside, certain ambivalence toward market mechanisms, at least from some people in Cuba, toward material incentives. So therefore, we do see that in history, not too far back. So we also can, as a proposition to me to be assessed, can say that perhaps periods of excessive orthodoxy have been less friendly to growth than periods of liberalization. I think we can say that perhaps the periods when Cuba liberalized is when it grew, or adjusted more or less successfully to tough conditions. The socialist leviathan, the strong socialist state, has been really not very effective in creating conditions for sustained economic development. And I venture a couple of propositions that Cuba does need to, but that's more kind of personal commentary. Is, the issue needs to focus on state reform, on the issue which is debating within Cuba. Less state and more society, more market. Current logic would lead from Leninist state socialism to enable what I would call enabler state socialism, enabler socialism, just facilitate private operators what it's doing now to accept more. So and that leads to less state and more and quite different organizational forms in terms of private sector, private state, cooperatives, and so on and so forth. Ironically, states that in my reading of reform processes worldwide, states that are effectively reforming include China and perhaps Vietnam and others, but also others in Europe and Latin America, have been strong states that are able to develop expertise in implementing and carrying out these reforms, adopting and embracing them, having the political capital and to sustain them. And I begin to have my doubts when I get to Cuba when I see some forms of debate. So I think this is a question more than a conclusion. I think I'm going to close here, and I think we still have time for some questions and answers. Good, thank you. We will take some questions from you. Yeah, try to be succinct so that we can use our 15, how much time do we have? 15, 20 minutes, effectively. Hallelujah.
Una pregunta para Emerson. Ella me cuestionó mis datos de salario real y base. Entonces, yo también le hago la pregunta de los datos de las exportaciones. Si son tomados de la ONU o son estimaciones propias. Porque yo había hecho otro análisis y en términos reales las exportaciones como se estancan, pero en términos nominales sí hay un crecimiento, sobre todo en el año 2009 y 2010. Y estábamos pensando que si bien Cuba, sobre todo eso tiene que ver con la exportación de servicios médicos, si bien Cuba ha dejado de enviar nuevos médicos, ¿no? con menos crecimiento, había un acuerdo de aumentar el precio de los servicios médicos si aumentaba el precio del petróleo. Y esa era la explicación por la cual las exportaciones crecían y seguían siendo un factor de crecimiento del PIB.
Anything.
In English.
Okay, let's take 3 questions.
Cambio para Mauricio Font.
Oh, my.
No, sí, en este análisis histórico, yo he visto que muchos especialistas hacen bastante analogía entre el periodo de rectificación y el periodo actual de actualización. ¿Cuáles serían, en tu opinión, las principales diferencias entre el proceso actual de actualización y lo que fue la rectificación?
Muy bien, 2 questions. Emilio Cueto, we haven't seen him here in New York for quite a while at the Bildner Center. Great Cuba specialist, and we will do an event with him in next few weeks.
Yo tengo una pregunta para el profesor Triana, y es una pregunta más bien teórica. El 16 de abril del 61 Fidel declara la Revolución Socialista, y en nombre del socialismo se hicieron muchas cosas. Se eliminaron las empresas privadas, se cerró el mercado, la ofensiva revolucionaria, se abrieron mercados campesinos, se quitaron los mercados campesinos en la operación Pipirre en el Adámbaro, se rectifica, se actualiza. Entonces yo realmente no sé lo que es el socialismo. Entonces viene Chávez con el socialismo del siglo XXI, que pareciera que Cuba se quedó en el socialismo del siglo XIX. Entonces yo quisiera saber, en su opinión, qué cosa haría que Cuba, qué medidas podría tomar Cuba en que en su opinión ya no es socialista.
Esa es la segunda pregunta. La tercera, Samuel Farber.
Sí, que mi pregunta es para Adrián Hearn y que es sobre esta situación donde los restaurantes chinos, de dónde vienen las provisiones, ¿no? Y lo que quiero saber es si en realidad lo que no puede haber aquí un problema de la gallina y el huevo. O sea, mencionaste a Brasil y las inversiones en Brasil, etcétera. Pero cómo esa inversión en el puerto de Mariel puede proveer esos bienes que son necesarios para el restaurante y luego la conexión. Y lo único que se me ocurre es que abran un frente de producción de bienes intermedios, sea bajo el patrocinio del Estado, sea bajo el patrocinio privado, lo que sea, para proveer esos bienes. Si no, estamos hablando de una situación irremediable. Me viene por asociación, quizá distante, me viene el aumento de los problemas que tuvo Gorbachev en los finales de los 80s en la Unión Soviética, cuando todo el proceso ese de la terapia de choque y eso, los presos fueron liberados, entonces no había mercancía para la gente, aquello fue un desastre, ¿no? Entonces, no es la misma situación, no digo que es lo mismo, pero por asociación me refiero a estas situaciones que aparentemente son insolubles. Y por eso digo, si hay un problema, la gallina y el huevo.
Bueno, terminante. Tenemos ya, we have 3 questions. We'll take another 3 later. Emily, you want to go first?
Yeah, it's a very specific question, which is great. Yeah, the problem on the external accounts is that a lot of the series finished in 2009. And so I don't actually have any firm or any figures on that. What we do have is you have to look in speeches and then the odd number that comes out every now and then you have to try and fill in the gaps. So I suppose what I had is the current account figure, and then you have the goods trade figure, and then you have to try to decide what fills that between the current transfers and the factor incomes and the services. All right, so there's an estimate there which is based on the assumption that the transfers are growing, which it may be wrong, but I would have thought, and also on piecing together the news stories about the extent to which the services are increasing. They're certainly not increasing at the pace that they used to be increasing. But if you have some firmer figures, I would love to see them. But I think the story still remains the same. It's not driving the economy anymore. The growth in services exports is no longer driving the economy, even if in nominal terms there might be an increase linked to the oil price. Does that answer your question? Not fully, but yes, it highlights the difficulty with the numbers.
Juan.
Bueno, muy rápido. Yo pienso que hay al menos en el orden social una medida que significaría el abandono de la línea socialista de Cuba, que es la eliminación del acceso gratuito a la educación y la salud de toda la población. Esa es una. Pero eso es muy común, ¿no? En muchos países que no son socialistas tienen acceso gratuito a la educación y la salud. Y en términos de económico o de propiedad, yo creo que si el Estado renuncia a ejercer la propiedad de alguna manera, quizás hay que cambiarla mucho, pero si renuncia a ejercer la propiedad o el control estatal sobre algunos sectores que son básicos para la reproducción de la economía y del país, se estaría renunciando también al socialismo. Digo algunos, o sea, hay un grupo de sectores. Es una discusión vieja en Cuba, reeditada ahora, pero definitivamente al menos 2 o 3 sectores hay en Cuba sobre los que el Estado debería mantener la propiedad estatal. Esa es mi idea básica.
No sé si debo contestar en español o inglés. Usted me dice, Mauricio.
Lo que tú quieras.
Bueno, como la pregunta era en español, respondo en español. Bueno, me hizo la pregunta de dónde vienen las provisiones para los restaurantes.
¿De dónde vendría, dado lo que dijo Brasil?
Sí. Bueno, llego a esta parte.
Okay.
Ahora lo que está pasando es que muchos de los dueños de los restaurantes tienen vínculos ya en China y van viajando a la feria de Cantón, por ejemplo, a buscar los materiales y vuelven. También hay un vínculo ya en la comunidad china de La Habana y la de la Ciudad de México, y entonces entre los dos van y juntos van a la feria de Cantón. Es muy interesante. Y mucho de eso es informal, no declarado. Muchos de los productos entran sin declarar. Claro, como el resto de la economía también, están entrando productos por los que vienen, familiares que vienen a visitar a Cuba, también es otra fuente. El punto en cuanto a Mariel, yo creo que tiene que ver más con la emergencia de un sector cuentapropista más general, ¿no? O sea, la posibilidad de ver un ingreso de bienes a través de Mariel podría beneficiar, claro, los restaurantes, pero más ampliamente sería para los negocios cuentapropistas por lo general. Hace 2 semanas tuve una entrevista con un general del ejército que está involucrado en Mariel. Me dijo que hay 2 fases. La primera fase es una parte de contenedores, para poner contenedores, shipping containers.
Shipping containers.
Y la segunda fase, que es preciso, que todavía no existe, sería una Special Economic Zone, ¿verdad? Para manufacturar, básicamente, y asemblar productos. Esto también forma parte del plan para dar suministro a los negocios emergentes, ¿no?
¿Quién sería propietario de eso, el Estado o privado?
Lo que yo sé, me imagino que debe ser del Estado. Hay asesores de Singapur ahora que están ayudando en esto. Mira, pero más generalmente, lo que veo yo, en Barrio Chino, cuando anduve por aquí hace 2 semanas, me están preguntando a mí si yo puedo hacer conexiones para ellos en China, porque saben que yo voy mucho a China. Lo que veo entonces es una diversificación de voces. Y estas preguntas vienen del mismo gobierno, el gobierno local de Barrio Chino, preguntándome a mí si yo puedo ayudar en hacer vínculos en China. Y entonces es interesante, hay un gran rango ya que está abriendo. Y por último voy a comentar que todo esto depende a nivel local, sobre todo en Barrio Chino, en las regulaciones del Ministerio de Justicia, porque las ONGs, y legalmente son ONGs, las asociaciones, no pueden entrar en actividades comerciales, pero están buscando este año o el año que viene un cambio en la ley de asociaciones del Ministerio de Justicia que va a dar más espacio a esta posibilidad.
Pavel, comparing rectification to the current phase since 2008 afterward, is your question? Well, I think it's the world difference. I think rectification is a reactive decision or approach campaign by the leader who is concerned with what was happening in institutionalization. And to that extent, it wants to reaffirm the same ideas that have been affirmed in the past. I mean, state control, and so on and so forth. And I tend to agree with Carmelo Mesalago that there's a lot of ideology that kicks in at that moment in this reactive response. There are economic problems, as I pointed out, but clear, I don't think you can react to economic crisis one way or another, in different ways. So why do you have to react to this strong rectification? So I tend to view them as a very different thing. Rectification is a reactive, or kind of going back to what had worked in the 60s and Fidel's role in the whole process, etc. What happened in 2008 is a search of a new vision, as Juan Triana pointed out. And as some of you have pointed out, there's a search for a new model. It's not yet fully analyzed or fully articulated, but that's what is on the table. So it's a search for a new model, which you can call it socialism. Carmelo said in response to Jose Rodriguez, there are different kinds of socialism. Scandinavian socialism, social democracy, Chinese, is China socialist? Vietnam socialist. I mean, you have a whole range of countries that are empirically now, if you take a survey around the world, call themselves socialist. Is North Korea socialist? So there, I don't know what kind of socialism. So Cuba would have to make a decision as to. I mean, I don't feel uncomfortable with the word label socialism is abroad. And then you mentioned Chavez, in Chile 21. And there are parties in Latin America, in Chile, there's a socialist party. It's a well-established term throughout Latin America, there's no problem in using it, defining it, but I do think that the essence of the moment is to, yes, perfect socialism, update it, but essentially alter what it stands for in a very fundamental way. And toward what? Toward the business forms that we just read about. All of these concessions that may go into Mariel, all of what the Havana Centro is doing in terms of the businesses, the hotels, tourism, and then you need to bring in Cubans, Cuban entrepreneurs into partnerships with state, partnerships with others, and perhaps, in my view, to make this hybrid socialism or whatever it is function and if by that we mean liberalization. So it's a stark contrast. Again, looking at this from the outside, and obviously this is something we may want to deepen here in debates in the future. We'll take another round of questions, and we have somebody here, who was it before? Jonathan Conning, Peter Wynn, and then you. And then, yeah. With actually 4 questions, because that's all the time we have. So, Jonathan Conning, please.
Okay, una pregunta para Adrian en inglés. So you talk about sort of experiments that they can borrow from the Chinese, and so I'm just curious if you could get a bit more specific. And in particular, I'm thinking about like the town village enterprises that China used, kind of at a period which seems similar. Sort of you couldn't legitimately get rich as an individual. You kind of made partnerships with a local government, and that kind of also helped you bundle rights in ways that kind of made it much more flexible. Is that something that Cuba is ready to do, or would be positioned to do, or you just elaborate a bit?
So one question, I saw a hand here, Peter Wynn.
This question is to you, really. I roughly agree with your history of Cuba, but my reading of it is that what you have is a pattern of pendulum swings, and that between these two different alternative general ideas, and the pendulum continues to swing until it causes a crisis, or until there is some kind of external crisis or shock which that particular model cannot adapt to. And my question then is, why should this pendulum swing be any different?
Yeah, that is my question, but I will go back to the thank you. We have, yes.
Mi pregunta es al señor Triana. Se plantea una serie de planes de reestructuración para el desarrollo económico en Cuba. La reciente noticia de limitar la estancia de la persona en el puesto político, es decir, una reestructuración de cómo ha funcionado el gobierno en Cuba, ¿tendrá algún impacto en estos planes de reestructuración económica? ¿O qué impacto ha tenido?
So, Mario González Corso, by the way, he came late. He should have been helped introduce the whole process. He's a co-organizer. And Mario, yes, what was your comment?
Thank you. My question, real quick for Emily. I noticed that you talked about current transfers, right? And I was wondering, and you mentioned the connection between that and reserve accumulation and the possibility that that's in preparation for the monetary unification. But I was also wondering about the numbers, if you know, if there's a breakdown of the numbers somewhere, because whenever I look at these aggregate macro indicators for Cuba, one difficulty that I have is on it that I just finding, the disaggregated number. So if you have any comments on that.
Okay, anybody else? Because that's all we have time for. Comments are very fast. Yes, Gary.
Yeah, just a quick comment, really. When we look at what's happening in Cuba and these changes in policies, we can look at the Eastern European models, transformation and what's happening there. But I would contend you could just as easily look at Latin America. I mean, in '94, I wrote a paper on predicting the course of reform in the Soviet Union based on Argentina, where you have seen this great swings from this, it was never as socialist as Cuba, but from Peronismo to attempts at liberalization back and forth, that has now gone on, what, almost 60 years.
Argentines seem to love the tango.
My question is, it's not making a comment, I'm trying to make a question out of it. Are we likely to see the same thing in Cuba? And interestingly, regardless of the political changes, are we likely to see this movement back and forth between market liberalization and socialist types of models, statist types of models?
So what is your question?
For every-
It's more of a comment.
I think we're going to see,
Very fast, one, very fast, but we're really out of time. Yes, very fast, please.
Okay, this question is for Professor Byrne, since Australia there. Is there any possibility of investments from Australia itself into Cuba, and start in what areas?
Okay, very good. That's all we can take. And then again, there'll be a new session. I'd love to hear from the Cubans from Cuba, but we don't have time for that now. We'll do that later. Who wants to go first? You two?
Well, maybe my one's the simplest question, really. The lack of data is I didn't labour that point more. There's a mysterious lack of data since 2009 on the external accounts. And so you have to, there must be a reason for it. Okay, so either there's a general move towards lack of transparency, which doesn't seem to fit with a lot of other things, or there's a reason why they're hiding the figures. And I'm guessing that it's something to do with, I mean, usually they hide the figures more when the US is more aggressive in the imposition of penalties. Well, that's been going on to a certain extent, but I don't think that's, well, my guess is that that's not explaining it. My guess is that there is something else going on in there. First, I thought it was just the Venezuela deal being so complex and untransparent it was difficult to disentangle. But I think there's more than that. There really has been a complete nothing said. And you know, if you are anticipating an exchange rate adjustment, then that's what you would do. I'm not saying that I'm sure that that's what the case is, but it's a possibility.
Okay. Bueno, yo creo que la decisión de limitar el poder sí puede tener impactos en uno y otro sentido sobre los proyectos de desarrollo. De todas maneras, quisiera subrayar que el proyecto de desarrollo que en algún momento se va a discutir en Cuba tendrá que ser aprobado por la Asamblea Nacional y por lo tanto va a tener, yo diría, un poquitico más de ámbito que el estar cerrado a un programa presidencial. No es un programa presidencial. O sea, el hecho de que Raúl sea el presidente ahora y que después deba ser dentro de 4 años otra persona, no limita el alcance de ese programa de desarrollo. Hay un compromiso que va más allá del programa presidencial o de quien sea el presidente, y ese programa tiene que ser aprobado por la Asamblea Nacional. De todas maneras, yo sí pienso que es conveniente y muy conveniente que esa limitación del cargo, porque ese programa de desarrollo puede significar un incentivo para la nueva persona que ocupe el cargo en el orden de hacerlo más dinámico y mejor. Yo creo que eso sí es bueno. Por eso habría ahí una doble lectura. Anyway, I want to answer about the pendular behavior of policy in Cuba, and I agree with you. I think in the last 50 years of the history of Cuba, the policy behaviors have been pendular. But in this case, I think it's different because there are a special combination of facts the end of the historic generation of the revolution is one of the most important facts. But the other is the experience of the development in the world in the last 40 years. And I think today Cuba is really wide open to learn about on these experiences. And the third, I think, is the special situation of the Cuban economy today. The Emily chose in her presentation what is the situation in Cuba today. So these three facts may be pushed in order to change the pendular behavior of the policy in Cuba.
Okay, well, thanks for the two questions. In terms of possible parallels or lessons from China's experience of development in the 80s, yeah, to the contemporary situation now, I used to say this sort of 7-8 years ago, saying that there are things that were running in parallel, yeah. But people used to sort of laugh at me and say, no way, I mean, look at the scale is completely different, the industrial base is completely different between the two, you can't make this comparison. And, you know, I think in terms of the points you make of linking up between state institutions and local production groups, community groups, there is some relevance. I'd say the main difference is what we've seen in China more recently is the development of collective and collective business into collective shareholding that I don't really see for in Cuba, a sort of collective approach in creating shareholder groups. But that said, I think more broadly there are some really important overlaps. I mean, I'll read you this quote here, three quotes: reform and opening up, undue emphasis on formality and bureaucracy, and corruption and bribe taking. Those apply very much to Cuba, but those are part of Xi Jinping's acceptance speech, and he's talking about China. So these are things that obviously in Cuba and China are serious concerns. Both countries want to halve the percentage of GDP of investment. So Cuba's talking about reducing from 90% to 45%, China from 45% to 25%. So again, how do you do that and maintain some sort of stability? That's critical, and for this reason, the two countries are talking to each other. And you probably don't know Omar Pereira Hernandez, who's the son of the former, I believe, ambassador, Cuban ambassador in China. He's now in Mexico doing his master's, but he's tracked the exchange of officials going between Cuba and China. And he says it's more than any other Latin American country, and it's precisely these issues that they're looking at. So I think certainly there are some lessons there.
Okay.
Just quickly on the Australian investment in Cuba, I don't know if you've been talking to people in the Australian government, but you've sort of hit on something that's a very current topic at the moment. Because yes, the answer is yes. There are now Australian investments in Cuba. It's in the health sector. We're talking about substantial amounts of money. This has to do with training Cuban medical brigades as they enter the Asia-Pacific region, and their level of English, their level of familiarity with the region isn't really as high as it should be. And since the Australian government finances the health ministries of most of those islands, we're now investing in capacitación, training of Cuban doctors before they go out. And also so that the students that have gone from the islands to the El Elam in Cuba, when they return back to their islands, that they'll be able to integrate and continue studying.
You talking about the South Pacific Islands?
Yeah, the South Pacific Islands, exactly.
Like Fiji, for example?
Fiji is part of the project.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, Oscar, I think you had your hand up before. Rápidamente.
Muy rápido, era un comentario para Emily sobre el tema del desempleo, la tasa de desempleo en Cuba tiene una doble lectura. El incremento de la tasa de desempleo puede venir o bien como se expresaba, pues por un incremento de los desempleados que vienen del sector estatal en este caso, pero también hay que tomar en cuenta de manera muy significativa todas aquellas personas que están hoy en la población económicamente inactiva que superan el 1.000.000. En la medida en que el Estado paternalista reduce este paternalismo, digamos, pues comienzan entonces a tratar de insertarse en la población económicamente activa y empiezan a incrementar la tasa de desempleo. Creo que esa es una de las fuentes más importantes que en el futuro veríamos como origen de la tasa de desempleo y que sería vista además de manera positiva y no necesariamente de manera negativa. O sea, es un matiz interesante.
See, the question of the swing, Peters, there's a great comparison between Argentina and Chile. And Juan Corradi wrote a book a while back, The Fitful Republic, to pertain to Argentina. The fit, they said, country that's it's driven sometimes by fits of moving this way or that way, peronismo, anti-peronismo, different currents, peronismo, etc. Chile, of course, and that is, many people argue that's happening now with the swing current economic policies, or maybe happening. Chile is a heck of a contrast. Chile is a country that, yes, had a strong dictatorship and changed the course of the country, but the basic course was maintained by a socialist coalition, and there has been sustained policy and a sense of direction and model, definition of model, and they haven't deviated much from that. Whether one likes it or not, or whether it's one's preference and we would like to see is correct, that essentially they have been building a very stable model. So there's a nice contrast between Argentina and Chile. Now, will Cuba be more like Argentina? Well, there are many comparisons we've made here in the years with Cubans and Argentines. But I will not bore you with them. Cubans tend to also be sometimes subject to this. Well, let me not get into trouble. Suffice it to say that once I called Argentina the Cuba of South America, in reference to its own sense of in world affairs, in reference to its sense of its in the international scene, and effectiveness, and so on and so forth. And in terms of national character, but that's a personal job. I actually believe that I agree with Juan that this time is different in Cuba. I actually believe that la tortuga, la hipotea, is not going to be shifting from one side to the other. I think it is moving in some kind of direction, hopefully, and that we see a clear statement of intention by Raúl Castro and some other leaders, but not all, I have to say, so therefore I have my doubts. We have a process that we have been analyzing here. We thank the Cuban economists for being here and illustrating us on these issues. And we have the realities that Juan alluded to, the fact that la generación de los históricos se despide de la historia, ¿no? Está despidiendo la historia, y we're witnessing a new generation coming into the leading roles in Cuba, perhaps some of you, and they will inevitably play the leading key role in the next chapter of Cuban history. We look forward to listening from you, so rather than answering my question definitely and decisively here, I will defer to my colleagues, and I want to look up to the next session so we can hear from them what they have to say about the question of swings. We have coffee next door, we have some other things to eat, and we thank you all, and above all the panelists.